with the aim to examine the repercussion, the sustaining geopolitical strata accountable for the climate change, and to figure out its possible solutions. We now move to an enlightening lecture by Professor Serenella Iovino on just a second, on the geopsychology of climate change, animals, arcs, and the making of the human mind. Now, without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Serilana Iovino for her lecture. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for this very generous and rich introduction. And so, Professor D.K. Singh, Professor Siddhartha Singh, Professor Rishikesh, um, Rishikesh, so thank you so much for this generous invitation. And I'm also very grateful to the Ecosophical Foundation for the Study of Literature and Environment and the National Postgraduate College of Lucknow for making this beautiful conference possible and for inviting me here. I would like to start this talk, this presentation, just like yesterday, perhaps it was Siddhartha Singh did, with an invocation to peace. So I would say Shanti, Shanti, and this is also very important. And so it is a true honor to be here in Lucknow. At a moment in history, we have a PowerPoint. Can we? And can I also control the PowerPoint, perhaps? Okay. Thank you very much. As the PowerPoint starts, I really would like to concentrate on peace, which is the foremost gift that we can give each other. Thank you. Okay. So, okay. Do I have the possibility to control? Oh, I can tell. Okay. Thank you. Okay. It is a true honor to be here at a moment in history when the geopolitics of climate change demands not only scientific and political clarity, but also cultural imagination and emotional courage. For many years now, my work has revolved around animals, real and fictional, and around the stories, images, and forms of thought that bind human and to other living beings. Today, I would like to bring this perspective into our conversation about climate geopolitics. Because the maps we draw, the negotiations we struggle with, and the planetary crisis we face are never just technical or diplomatic matters. They are also stories about who we believe we are, what we choose to remember, and what or whom we fear losing. In an age marked by unprecedented ecological upheaval, from accelerating extinctions to climate-driven displacements, I would like to propose an unusual lens, the theme of the ark, and the theme of how animals came to inhabit our mind. The theme of the ark will not be treated as a biblical tale, but as a deep time narrative, a structure of feeling, a cultural device that humanity has long used to grapple with planetary crisis, loss and responsibility. The arc, in its many variations, speaks not only to geopolitics, but also to what I will call geopsychology. And I was inspired by Rishikesh using this concept, so I thank him. So, the ways in which the Earth inhabits our imagination. This is what I call geopsychology. So let me take you on a brief journey from the Anthropocene to prehistoric hunting, from cave paintings to the myths of the flood, from extinction to de-extinction, to explore why animals are central to how we think, how we fear, and next slide, please. Okay, one of the most devastating effects of the Anthropocene and of climate change is the collapse of biodiversity. This is not new. Scientists remind us that we are living through one of the most dramatic periods in the planet's biological history, and not only because of climate change. According to many estimates, the current extinction rate is astonishing. Species are disappearing between 100 and 10,000 times faster than the natural background rate. Some estimates speak of 200 to 2,000 species lost every year among those we know. Imagine, it is as if every year an entire city of living being vanished, often without us even noticing. Not surprisingly, scientists refer to this as the sixth mass extinction, and yesterday it was quoted. Elizabeth Colbert wrote a very important book about that. And about 1 million species out of roughly 8 million known or estimated are now at risk of disappearing in the near future. So the link between extinction, we can have and climate change is not new. For millennia, the two have been tied together in the human imagination. We see this in the global recurrence of flood myths, many of which, as some scholars suggest, may preserve distant echoes of late glacial or early Holocene climate disruptions. From Mesopotamia with Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh to here India, and to Mesoamerican traditions, in which great floods mark the end of one humanity and the beginning of another, the flood appears as a deep cultural memory of ecological crisis and radical transformation. Okay, but searching for ways to cope with anxiety, so the arc, of course, myths are also a way that we use to manage our anxiety, our fears, our hopes. But of course, today we have other myths. One of these myths, in my interpretation, is the extinction. So in recent decades, we have seen the rise, but it's also perhaps a dream of the extinction. So we all know Jurassic Park, both the Spielberg movie and the novel by Michael Crichton. So that was fiction. But today, similar narratives, and I insist on the term narratives, are being advanced by large biotech companies, mostly American ones. The Texas-based Colossal Bioscience, and I think that the name already speaks to the project and, of course, also to the bombastic ambitions of this company. So this company is promising to bring back animal species lost thousands of years ago. In 2023, they announced the return of the dodo. We're still waiting, by the way. In 2024, they presented what they described as the dire wolf. So you see, the dire wolf is a sort of prehistoric wolf, and it's mostly famous because it appears as a character in Games of Thrones and in the Marvel cartoons. So from the fictional imagination, they have recreated this dire wolf. But of course, and they are also trying to recreate iconic species like the thylacine or the woolly mammoth, the moa, so extinct species. But let me say it clearly, the extinction is not a solution to extinction. The first reason is technical. It is not possible to bring back the exact same animals. What we obtain are always genetic compromises. The often fragmentary DNA of extinct species must be reconstructed through genome editing technologies such as CRISPR and implanted into a host species. So it's genetic editing, but actually this is not a way to replicate the very same DNA. Another method is backbreeding, selecting animals that most resemble an extinct ancestors. And that was the case with European aurochs, recreated through selective breeding in the early 20th century. So you just, as you do with dogs or other species, you select the phenotype. You don't select the genotype in this case. So in both cases, what emerges is a phenotypic approximation, not a true return. So the second reason why de-extinction is not is impossible is even more important, and it is because species do not disappear alone. They vanish together with their habitats and the ecological networks that sustain them. As David Quammen has argued, an ecosystem is like a tapestry of species and relationships. And I like the metaphor of the tapestry because I think that this is the right place to imagine all this mosaic of species and relations. So if you cut out and isolate one section, the whole fabric begins to unravel. So a species needs a world to exist. Laboratory individuals are not enough to prevent extinction. This is why the extinctions resemble more than a conservation strategy, a seance, summoning an animal without restoring the world that made it possible. Please, next slide. But the real question, a psychological one, is another. Why are we fascinated by these experiments? And why this intense nostalgia for vanished animals, so intense that we dream of recreating them in a lab? And also, we should ask, why, along with this nostalgia, we feel nostalgia for the lost species, but there are millions of species that we don't even see today. And there are animals that we treat just like things. So we live in this discrepancy, we live in this ambiguity, in this dilemma, and it's also a sort of cognitive dissonance, therefore another psychological theme. So, but why do we feel this presence of animals so deeply embedded in our memory, in our cravings, in our psyche, I would say? And I think that we have to dig into the evolutionary history of the human mind to understand this, because I think that animals are, and I'm not making this up, but they are our first archetypes, not only in the not only in the Jungian sense, of course that too, but as primordial forms of perception and thought. Our language is full of animals. We hound someone, we badger them, we whistle out of things, we monkey around, or peacock when we want attention. Our metaphors inhabit the same bestiary. We can be as sly as a fox, stubborn as a mule, busy as a bee, and I love bees, bee is my totemic animal, or a lone wolf. So we shed crocodile tears, and sometimes we let the cat out of the bag. So our perceptual system, it's very gestalt, is shaped by them. We evolved to pick out animal forms in the landscape, and our myths and cultures are saturated with their figures. So, this is something we know. What we reflect on far less often is that animals taught us how to think, that it is with them and because of them that the human mind, which is a process of embodiment, took shape. Of course, the evolution of the human mind is a mosaic process shaped by many factors: social life, language, tool-making, parenting, environments. But some others, anthropologists, paleontologists, archaeologists of the mind, have insisted on one particular strand in this tapestry. So, according to some, the evolution of our mental faculties, faculties that we have always to imagine as embodied, because there is no dualism between mind and body, but I'm talking to an audience that is hugely familiar with this concept. So the evolution of the human mind, sorry, uh, is tightly bound to our relationship with animals, to their presence and their images. People often mention this when speaking of cave paintings, but the story is far older. Several scholars, for example, the anthropologist and philosopher and ecologist Paul Shepard, American, very important figure for the environmental humanities, the Australian scholar Louis Liebenberg, or the French philosopher Baptiste Morisot, argue that the mind is the child of the hunt, and that the end of the logic that underlies hunting, tracking. So they say something. I'm always tempted to leave the paper behind, but this is something that I want to say without reading, because it's such a fascinating story. So we are talking here about more than 2 million years ago. We are talking about the Australopithecus africanus, who was not yet a hunter, but already ready to follow the tracks of the animals, the signs of the traces that they left. So he was a gatherer, so he was a frugivore, so he was collecting the food that he was finding, and identify certain signs in the environment and to recognize them as bearers of danger or action. And of course, the whole landscape would become slowly a banquet of signs, and this is how Paul Shepard defines it. But from Australopithecus africanus to Homo erectus and Homo ergaster, and Homo habilis, the hunt began. And so our ancestors became hunters and gatherers. And of course, the signs in the landscape multiplied increasingly, and along with them, of course, our mental capacities. The mind was taking shape, was forming itself in the presence of other animals. We were hunting. Environment itself became a sort of story, because of course, when you have signs, you need to interpret them. You have a text. The landscape itself becomes a huge text to be read. And therefore, these hominids, our ancestors, developed the mental capacities to interpret this text, which was inhabited by animals. So they were the first presences with whom we were mirroring, in whom actually we were mirroring ourselves. So they were our mirrors, they were our companions or our competitors in this huge landscape of science. And of course, another very important step in this process was butchering these animals, because we entered in touch with the interior of a landscape that was also resembling our own interior. And so we were exchanging also anatomical knowledge, and we were actually putting these figures, these presences into our own body, and of course, we were interiorizing them. So as the process of remembering, time binding, also interpretation of science was refining. So we were able to detach, actually, the images, to detach, also to get rid, to make without the material presence of an animal. We were remembering the landscape. We were starting to remember. We were starting to form concepts. And a very important moment in this uh, dematerialization of the external environment was also memory and the ingestion of other animals, actually. So we were interiorizing them, and they became part of our psyche. They became part of our also of our memory. So actually, our relationship to the animals became more and more spiritual, and in fact, it started to mirror a cosmology. There was also a correspondence between the interior of animals and the larger, also the larger cosmology, the larger system of stars, for example. There are ways to prevent, divine the future that were actually based on the interpretation of the liver of certain animals. And there is a correspondence between the stars and this and the interiors of animals. But anyway, what I want to underline here is that the animal, the other animals, just became not simply an external presence, but also an internal presence. And of course, the role of tracking was very, very important. By becoming internal presences, by becoming psyche presences, of course, the animals also became mythical figures, and this is also an important part. But again, if you go back to tracking, if you go back to hunting, many other scholars extend also this practice to the development of our capacity for empathy. And so many contemporary trackers, including Baptiste Morisot, for example, describe this. But I would like to share with you a small fragment of an interview I had with a movie director, Craig Foster. You might have seen his documentary, My Octopus Teacher. And it's an award, an Academy Award-winning documentary that I really strongly recommend. And he's himself a tracker. He told me that tracking is a gradual learning, not only to think like the animal you follow, but to feel like this animal. So, but I would like to share with you just a couple of minutes of this interview that I think are very eloquent. Also to mark the passage between our perception of the other animal and our capacity to feel empathy with this animal and to identify with other animals through tracking.
I'm sure you must. With engravings. Um,
Okay, finally. Sorry, this is a long interview, but let's see, let's see.
with engravings. Um, a lot of scenes similar to what you're talking about in your caves in France, not as old. And then, of course, and I spent 7 years there with my mentor, rock art mentor, who's a well-known archaeologist, genetic, and he taught me a lot about what the art means and what we know about it and connecting the old records from the 1800s. And then, as you say, I came across these incredible therianthropes.
Therianthropes are the hybrid human
So
and
it's a
animals.
big lot of interest, and I've spent a lot of time in Southern Africa walking and trying to find and photographing these things. But certainly one of the most interesting things, like you have, for me, are the therianthropes. And I think that that is connected to tracking. Because if you can imagine, and what you're doing in tracking
This is the important part.
you are looking at the marks that animals have made on the ground, and you're putting your mind into the mind of that animal again and again and again over years. And it develops an incredible empathy with the animal. It's an amazing sort of science of tracking where there's incredibly subtle pressure marks around the tracks, that not in the track, but around the tracks, that can tell a master tracker when the animal's head is lifting. Is it looking left? Is it looking right? Is it in stalking mode? It's absolutely incredible, the detail and information that can be drawn from the track. But so you throwing your mind, imagine, into that mind of the animal the whole time with imagining where it's going, and part of your survival depends on that. Then one day, suddenly you do that and you're inside the animal. You with me?
Yes.
So you are basically priming your whole mind to become part of the animal's mind, because that's what you do. That is what tracking is. That's what your survival is. So you every day you're becoming the animals that you are following through the tracking. So it's not surprising then that some of your art forms show the cross section between you and the creature. You with me?
Okay, I really wanted you to listen to, directly listen. Yeah, sorry. Go to the next. It's not very flattering as an image. I'm sorry. So, but I think that this is the most eloquent presentation of how tracking is a way to shape the human mind and also to shape the empathy that we have towards other species. Empathy, not in the sense of sympathy, but in the sense of feeling inside another animal's, another creature's body. And to feel inside another creature's body is also to extend our mind to other presences. So, as you can see, this is something that is doing today. It's an ancient practice, but the human species, Homo sapiens, has been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. And so we have this wired into our cognitive system, into our neurocognitive system. And so it's wired in our psyche as well. And of course, now if we jump a little bit ahead in time, we reach another evolutionary moment of our process of mind making. And so we have the moment of image making. And in fact, this is when cave painting started. We are talking about a constellation of caves painted all over the world, actually. We have examples of this from Europe, Australia, Oceania, the Americas, so everywhere, Africa, of course, especially South Africa. So the earliest known examples date back more than 45,000 years. This is the warty pig of Leang Tedogn in Indonesia, followed by the great European sites, Chauvet Pont d'Arc, around 36,000 years ago, Peshmerga, 25,000, Lascaux, 17,000 years ago, or Altamira in Spain, 14,000. But we find rock paintings across all continents, basically. And everywhere, always, we have animals, enormous animals, stylized animals, animals in motion. Here, too, that we can see that our mind is taking shape. Our mind does not simply produce images. It lives through images. And these images, in their dialogue with the body and the environment, become inner gestures, memories, meanings. So And it is a reciprocal relation. The hand that paints, the rock surface, the flickering light, the animal form, the movement of the brush, all these contribute to the birth of the image and to the mind that perceives it. It's a mutual creation between the image and the mind, between the environment and the human that is it's performing this gesture of making images. So it's really a circular creation, and the mind expands with that. So these images actually are our first cinema, we might say, because they were alive with the lights that were in the caves. They were alive with the shape of the rocks. They were alive with also with the perception that humans had in these oxygen poor caves. So it's really something that defines our creativity in a more extended way, because it's not simply the creativity that comes from the individual. It's the creativity that comes from the co-creation between the caves, the image of the animals, and the human mind. So everything just comes together. And so this is what philosopher and cognitive scientist Andy Clark calls the extended mind, not just the brain, but an interweaving of body and environment, each supporting each other. So mind, word, and body form interdependent circuits, each functioning only through the others. Seen in this slide, Paleolithic caves are actually a way to predict cinema. And here, the work of neuroscientists, Italian neuroscientists active in Parma, Giacomo Rizzolatti and Vittorio Gallese, who actually are responsible for the discovery of mirrored neurons. Their work is particularly illuminating in this respect. So this production of images continued for 10,000 of years. And then, at a certain point, it largely ceased in its Paleolithic form, more or less around the rise of the first agricultural and urban societies, at least in many parts of Europe. We can have actually the next slide. So it's that was not a clear rupture, but the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic brings a profound shift. In many regions of Europe, the great decorated caves were gradually abandoned. So the painting thinned out until they almost disappeared, and visual imagination moved to other supports: megaliths, stelae, portable objects, the first communal architecture. So we have the rise of agriculture and of urban communities. So the figures of our representations became more schematic, more geometric, and often more anthropocentric. So the symbolic landscape seemed to realign. The world of the caves, deep, animated, risky, ontologically horizontal, was closing, and the world of agriculture was opening. So we can see a sort of, it's not a causal connection, but it's a sort of a temporal coincidence between the time of the great cave paintings, the Paleolithic time, and then when the cave paintings were flourishing, and then the Neolithic shift to the agricultural time. So we see that these images are no longer the same. We actually broke this horizontality of representation, and we started seeing the animals as our slaves, as not longer as our companions, but as our slaves. And this is actually a threshold that Paul Shepard, that I was quoting, quoting before, also marks as the beginning of our not only culture, not only ecological crisis, but also of our psychological crisis. Because if you can see, there is a strong loss in our in the passage from the Paleolithic mind to the Neolithic mind. Paul Shepard, for example, he argues that for hundreds of years, even millions, human development unfolded in continuity with a world saturated with animal presences. So children grew up in dynamic, multisensory landscape where tracking, watching, and living alongside with wild creatures shaped attention. So that was imagination and empathy. That was a world full of animals. But with the Neolithic, this continuity begins to fracture. When animals cease to be teachers and interlocutors and become managed objects, something is broken, and an educational circuit that once bound psyche and the biosphere together disappears. So the long nostalgia for the Pleistocene is for Shepard the latent symptom of this rupture. The form of our mind, he says, is still the mind of hunter-gatherers. After all, it's a form that lasted nearly 2 million years. And this mismatch is one of the deep roots of our ecological madness. And it's actually perhaps it might seem simplistic, but reflect about it. This is a loss of a word, our perception of the perception of a world. We were living with animals in an horizontal way, and then we started changing our relationship with them, and changing our relationship also with the land, also with the environment. We started creating hierarchies that are functional to the establishment of systems of power. So across the same long arc of human experience, many cultures, especially in the ancient Near East, but not only, developed and consolidated myths of great floods and, in some cases, arcs. That stage, these myths stage hydroclimatic destruction, partial extinction, and the refounding of the living world. In many of these narratives, the flood condenses fears and memories of ecological crisis, but it also presents something very precise, the salvation of animals together with humans, inside a reduced and protected micro-world that we can call the Ark. So paleoclimatic and archaeological studies have often suggested that, at least in some cases, across the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean basin, and coastal or river regions prone to sudden flooding, these stories may be transformed echoes of real events. Rapid sea rise levels at the end of the glacial periods, the outburst of glacial lakes, major Holocene floods, catastrophic inundation that marked the end of one environmental regime and the beginning of another. In this sense, the flood has sometimes been described as a cultural archive of rare but devastating climatic crises, filtered through oral memory and later reshaped into myth. But even when we can, sorry, can we go forward with them? Again, the next. Okay. But even when such correspondences are plausible, they do not exhaust the meaning of the myth. At its core, the story is not only about the water that destroys, but also about what is chosen to be saved and how. In the Mesopotamian and biblical, can you go? No, sorry, before that. In the okay. In the Mesopotamian and biblical tradition, for example, the ark is not simply a boat of survivors. It is a small, selected ecosystem, a miniature chest of species. The animals are not incident details. They stand at the center of the narrative device, pairs of each kind, sometimes listed with minute precision, with distinction between clean and unclean, domestic and wild. And even where the theological emphasis falls on human sin and divine judgment, the structure of the story insists on one thing: no future is possible without animals. In other words, what the flood threatens to erase is not only a society or a civilization, but an entire order of the living. And what the ark preserves is not only a human lineage, but a web of ecological relationship. For this reason, the ark is both a device of selection, who decides who enters and who remain outside, and a device of care. So, for a time, adrift on the waters, humans are not masters but caretakers of a community of living beings larger than themselves. And of course, here in India, this conversation inevitably evokes ancient local traditions of the flood. The story of Manu and the fish Matsya, I don't know whether I pronounce it correctly, so deeply woven into cosmology and into the cycles of destruction and regeneration. I will not go into details as this is not my field, but I want to acknowledge that this tradition too preserves a way of thinking about crisis, loss, and the care of the living world. A world periodically submerged and restored, in which divinity itself takes animal form to guide salvation. So in this narrative, the animal is not only saved, but becomes a savior, the guide through catastrophe. So, rather than literal chronicles of single events, these stories function as narrative archetypes of deep ecological crisis and as cultural archives of climatic memory. So I think that they also teach us that the human being is not simply the object, the subject of something. It's not simply something that bears the responsibility for the damage, but it's also exposed to what your Amitav Ghosh calls the unthinkable. So the human being just has no way to prevent these catastrophes, but when these catastrophes happen, the humanity is floodable. It's not only the origin of the flood, it's floodable and exposed to the will of a divine power, for example. That also bids us to save animals with us. So it's very, very important. And placed alongside the disappearance of great animal paintings in the caves, the ark can be read as a final, powerful act of symbolic resistance, a way of affirming that even in a catastrophe, human history cannot endure by itself, and that any imagination of salvation is always, inevitably, a shared salvation of humans and animals. And with this, I will come to the final passage of my talk. In fact, I would like to end this story, for it is a story more than an analysis, by returning from the mind to the soul. And we can go with another slide. So another thinker, a psychoanalyst, reached intuitions remarkably close to Paul Shepard, but by a different route, through imagination and the psyche. His name is James Hillman, an American trained under Jung in Zurich, a cultural philosopher and extraordinary scholar. Hillman is one of those thinkers who shape reality as they interpret it. So it's a very, very influential intellectual. It has been important in many fields. Unlike Jung, for whom animals often appear as symbols or archetypes to be deciphered, forms of the collective unconscious that point beyond themselves, Hillman insists that images, including animal images, should be taken seriously as they present themselves. Animals, for him, are imaginal presences populating the psyche. They do not primarily point elsewhere. They are what they are. They reconnect us to the multiplicity of our own nature, which is inseparable from the nature of the living world, a dynamic field of images, vital energies, and emotions that Hillman calls the soul of the world, drawing on the Neoplatonic tradition. This is not the Gaia hypothesis. Hillman is not speaking of a global organism or a single planetary subject, nor it is a transcendent realm outside the world. The soul of the world is the living animacy of which we are part, the world of our natures and images that live through us and that we reflect in our life, in our dreams, in our cities. The individual psyche and the soul of the world are not separate. They are two faces of the same movement. This is why Hillman suggests we cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of ecosystem, to the loss of animals, to the destruction of places. These are wounds in the world, but they are also wounds in the soul. So if we are part of the soul of the world, as this sense of animacy, of course, we suffer. And this is this conference is, I think, the perfect mirror for this concept, which is very familiar to the Indian and the local sensibility. I think that nothing new can be said, even by great psychoanalysts, philosophers, and psychologists, that has not received already deep consideration in this country and in this culture. And if I want to say that, if I am not directly referring to your cultural tradition, it's only because of my ignorance, because I'm not particularly familiar with that. And I know this concept through European traditions, American traditions, but I realize more and more as I'm being with you also these days, and as I'm reading, and I really intend to do more, I realize that these concepts are so familiar to you that I don't even need to explain them to you. So my apologies, but really also my acknowledgement of your profound wisdom and history. So, with gratitude. And so, Hillman talks about the soul of the world. We are suffering with the soul of the world. Actually, returning to animals, Hillman speaks of a kind of amnesia, forgetfulness, that concerns our intimacy with the earth and with the other creatures. And this is an oblivion that we can begin to overcome only by learning to see animals again and to keep them alive within our psychic ecology. In dream, as in stories, we might say with him that the souls of animals meet our own soul as images. In this spirit, Hillman also suggests that each of us carries within an innumerable host of animals, not only metaphors, but psychic companions, traces of our shared animality. This is the ark we must save. From this perspective, the soul becomes an inner ark, and this is also Hillman speaking, a place where animals are not just symbols but real presences, living figures we keep and who in turn keeps us. By attending to their appearances, Hillman invites us to save the animals in our psychic ecology, to keep them alive as one preserves the seeds of an inheritance that it's not only biological but spiritual. We might say that, quoting him, that when the last giraffe or the last polar bear dies, something of that first giraffe named by Adam, the mythical animal taken onto the ark, dies as well. It is a loss of the word, but also a loss of the mind that imagined that word. So we have to save both our outside biodiversity and our inside biodiversity. So this is a correspondence between images and real presences. And we are actually the bearers of this tango, and we have to also be aware of that. And here, perhaps an ancient thought deeply rooted in this land offers another resonance. In the Buddhist tradition, especially in the practices of metta, loving kindness, and karuna, compassion, the relationship with animals is not a moral ornament, but an extension of mindful awareness. Compassion is not only a feeling, it is also a way of knowing. This is so important. One that recognizes the continuity of living beings. And metta, friendship toward all creatures, is also a cognitive gesture, a way of keeping open the door of the unconscious, of not severing our relation with what breathes outside and within us, of not enclosing the mind within too narrow a human fence. Seen in this light, what Hillman calls the soul of the world is not far from an intuition highlighted by many contemporary readings of Buddhism. The mind is not an enclosure, but a field crossed by multiple presences. Animals are companions in this field, not only metaphorically, but through a deep proximity. They are friends of the mind, we might say, because they teach us how to perceive, to imagine, to feel. And so dreams, stories, myths of the ark, and even the more extravagant projects of de-extinction can be read as attempts, conscious or not, to save a psychic ecology we cannot live without, attempts to hold on to an ancient friendship between human thought and animal life. So I have no easy solution to the crisis we inhabit. No one does. But I believe that in a time of climate change and irreversible loss, returning to these animal roots of our psychology, this geo or zoo psychology that binds mind and word, is a necessary gesture of awareness. For the ark today is not so much a vessel to build outside ourselves as a practice to cultivate within. It asks whom we wish to welcome, whom we are willing to listen to, and with whom we hope to cross the flood. Thank you very much. Namaste.
What a commendable, exemplary, and a comprehensive presentation. I think we should not be spendthrift in giving her a round of applause. Sir Iovino, it was indeed a very impressive session, and the depth of scholarship, the clarity of thought that she expressed in her session cannot be expressed in words. But moving without further ado, let me call Professor Shruti Das to shed light on her lecture.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share Saranella's lecture. I'm not only grateful, I've no words to express the comprehensive and the erudism in the lecture that I've just heard. She actually made my, outside biodiversity and inside biodiversity kind of breathe life into each other. I won't take a lot of time trying to summarize what she has said because it was all before you. All of you have heard that. I don't want to deprive both you and her from exchanging ideas. I know many of you must be having a lot of questions to ask her. But, she was talking about floods and ark, and with, I don't know, such sensitivity, such humility, she has expressed that she doesn't know much about Indian myths. Whatever she was talking about, the psychological impact of what animals have, it all resides in Indian psychology. And she rightly said that most of the things that she was saying was, we have a lot of mural paintings in India. Wherever you go, you find, there are monolithic rocks. I know in Odisha there are many monolithic rocks and there are many mural paintings. And all of us, she made us actually scratch the surface of our minds, relook at those things. When we go to those places, we are not the same people. After listening to this lecture, We are different. We look at it from her perspective, and we will see how our perception and the perception of our ancestors have shaped the way we think of animals, we think of ourselves, we think of our own psyches, and the way we empathize or we sympathize, and how we live, our outside world and the inside world, how they balance each other. And it's really a wonderful lecture, and I won't be an impediment or to your questions to her. I know you would like to listen to her more and more. I would have gone on listening to her, to the beautiful things she said. And over to you. I open the floor for questions, and I'm sure Saranala is waiting for all of you to ask her questions or, add to what she has said. Okay, so it's a learning process, and I'm not going to be a hurdle there. Thank you very much.
We now leave the room open for questions. If anybody has any questions, remarks.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very praiseworthy and commendable lecture. Was truly impressed and spellbound by your deep analysis. Now, it's not a question, it's just an observation. Your analysis of the arc of the human psyche, mind, as well as there being an inherent being and one being which connects animals, humans, plants, animals, flora, fauna, everything. Do you think it has anything to do with Arne's Ney's definition of deep ecology? Deep ecology. Does it bear any resemblance to deep ecology?
Oh, wow, you're
Thank you,
touching,
Thank
because
Because that also speaks about an inherent being, where we all are part of that big, large, inherent cosmos.
in fact,
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful exposition. That was indeed very enlightening. You ended your discourse with a question that it is very, very difficult to actually think what is the way to correct the environment or to check the environmental challenges or the climatic challenges that we are facing. What she said is the concept of deep ecology, which deep ecology is again very closely related with Buddhism.
of course, deep ecology, we all know, it is a platform of action. It's not simply a philosophy. And when Arne Næss was writing his platform on the Tvergastein mountain in Norway, it was actually reading Spinoza as well as Buddhist texts. And thank you for reminding us, because this is so important. Process philosophy, yeah. Um, Arnenes was very cognizant of Buddhist philosophy, and I think that this was a huge inspiration for him, as well as for example, poets like Gary Snyder, for example. There is a huge strand of Western intellectuals that really owe a lot to this tradition, including Schopenhauer, that we sometimes. But of course, when we talk about okay, it works. Sometimes it works. At times it doesn't. So not everything depends on human will. So anyway, yes, what deep ecology invokes is this horizontality among all living beings. And of course, this is something that is completely alien to any kind of political discourse. Therefore, there is a struggle between deep ecology and its principles, I mean, decision-making processes about the environment, about even social problems. So deep ecology is too difficult to think, to conceive. Also, because unlike Buddhism, it doesn't really address the human capacity also to compassion. I don't see in deep ecology an invocation to compassion. I see the invocation to overcome individuality and individualism, to overcome hierarchies, ontological hierarchies, to overcome violence. But anyway, he also says that a certain degree of violence is inevitable in ecology itself. So we eat and are eaten in a way. I think that you're right, but perhaps more than Arnenes, I would also prefer, I would prefer to see more Buddhism in political decisions, because Arnenes makes things too theoretical, whereas the deep and profound theories of Buddhism or spiritualism in religious terms, but in spiritual terms, in intellectual terms, might be really an inspiration for our political decision making about the environment. At the same time, you're talking about Capitalocene, Anthropocene, etc. I like to. After what I've said, it's clear that my inspiration here is more this very bad word that it's impronounceable, but it is actually a dream of reconstitution of human and animal companies and communities. So the only way to overcome all these scenes, the anthropocene, as Jussi Parikka says. So this obscenity of human exceptionalism, which has caused such upheaval in our in our ecosystems. So and in our society, might be only overcome if we enlarge our vision and reconstitute our human and animal companionship, not simply relationship, but companionship, which is not simply something that means loving each other, but also being in a situation which is alive, animate, and allowing for the differences to emerge and for the possibility to collaborate also to emerge. So we have to be aware of our animal companions and try to reconstruct alongside them the communities that we have destroyed so, I mean, so efficiently over the last 10,000 years. No. No, I'm a humanist. I don't think about, and of course, if human will end one day, of course, this is evolution, this is the planetary, this is a cosmological issue. So the human species is like every other species, it has a beginning and an end, and it will have an end. So at that point, we won't be worried anymore. But I will never ever wish a world without humans, because I like human beings. So that's a very personal. I love them.
I would
Not all
like
of
to,
them,
yeah.
but I think that they can do remarkable things.
Yeah, I would like to add to this.
Okay, so that was in my we eat something with the theory and action go together. So usually that is called yeah. So that is needed in fact. That theory is also required, which should be introduced into action. So I think this with this we can also introduce this particular organization, and you are a part of this, so you just move ahead with us. Okay, thank you.
I would just like to add something to what you were talking about, the horizontality between animals and humans and trees. This is replete in Hindu philosophy and in Hindu scriptures. You were talking about the fish, the Matsya avatar. When you read the Dasavatar, with which we begin our day every day, we we kind of thank the universe every day in the morning when we get up. Our first thing is Bhuvaswatat Savitur Varenyam. The first thing is that we will now seek the blessings of the sun. From that the light that the sun gives us is so important. Then we offer water to the tulsi plant, to the peepal tree, to the banyan tree, to the neem tree, to the bale tree. And there are 5 trees that every day, every Hindu household, they offer water and prayers to these sacred trees and to the amla tree. So you see vitamin C and shade and all kinds of things. Because these have medicinal properties, they give shade and all these things. Apart from that, we're talking about the Dasavatar. We not only think about the fish, Kesavadhruta Meena Avatara Jai Jagadisha Hare, we also have the tortoise, we have the boar, okay? And we have the horse in Kalki avatar, which is yet to come. And we have Buddha, the snails that protected Buddha from the heat when he was seeking nirvana, right? And, we have this communion, and the human self is extended into the animals in Panchatantra. I think you should look into Panchatantra. Panchatantra has been translated into most of the languages of the world and has been here for 1200 years, right? And it's practiced in the far west, right? Panchatantra. And we have like Kathasarit Sagar, where, in Panchatantra, all the characters are mostly animals or trees, which give wisdom to the kings or to the common people. So I think they predate the Aesop fables. So
Now, moving to the close of this session, you can ask her personally. We'll have time during the tea break, okay? Since we are running short of time, I would like to wind up. But I would like to wind up and still say I'm spellbound, ma'am. Okay. So now, on behalf of Ecosophical Foundation for the Study of Literature and Environment and National PG College, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Shushit Das and Professor Serenella Iovino for such an insightful and engaging lecture. Your exposition and scholarly perspectives indeed greatly enriched our understanding and left a lasting impression on both faculty members and scholars. Your ability to present complex ideas with clarity and depth made the session intellectually stimulating and highly rewarding. The lecture not only broadened our academic horizons, but also inspired meaningful discussions and critical thinking among the audience. We are truly thankful for your time, expertise, and gracious presence. We hope to have the privilege of welcoming you again for similar academic engagements in the future. Looking forward. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, audience. Now let us move to the second session.
I would like to thank Professor Iovino once again for her expertise and for delivering an extremely compelling talk and acquainting us with her rich body of work. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again. Now, moving on, we proceed to the next plenary session by Professor Andrea Lavazza, who is going to join us virtually. And along with him, we have Beatrice Pedretti from University of Milan, Italy. Please welcome her. Give her a huge round of applause, everyone. Together, they are going to deliver a talk on climate trauma and cognitive health, an empirical study on flood survivors in Emilia Romagna, Italy. The session will be chaired by Dr. Rishikesh Kumar Singh himself, President EFSLE New Delhi, and moderated by Ms. Ankita Kaushik, Assistant Professor Spanish, Lovely Professional University. She's also been shortlisted for China Travel Grant by EFSLE. I would like to call Professor Rishikesh on the dais to introduce the speakers and formally commence the session. Over to you, sir.
Good morning and namaste to all of you. This is, in fact, going to be a special session because, when I initiated to invite Professor Andrea Lavazza, actually, he is a neuroscientist. And I would like to I would take the opportunity to introduce him. He was unable to visit personally and physically, so he just, he suggested me and named Beatrice, and he told that they are working on the same project together. So I was so happy to welcome Miss Beatrice. And here I would like to introduce Professor Andrea. Professor Andrea is, he is a professor and fellow in neuroethics at the Center of University Arezzo, Italy. Yeah. Maybe go. Actually, Andrea has sent his recorded message. Yeah, because he was unable to connect directly online. So we will play his, message afterwards. So he is from the University of Milan, as well as professor of moral philosophy at Picasso University, Italy, Naples, Italy. His research focuses on moral philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and new technologies, including AI and neurotechnologies. And also, he tries to explore the connection of neuroscience with the climate issues. So that was the something special which attracted me to invite for his to present his research project. So Lavazza has published 15 books so far, and as an author and editor, over 130 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. So for this particular session, the specific research work both are doing, the Andrea and Beatrice. Yeah? So I think it is good, better to, you would go ahead with the Andrea's message, okay, right now. So I think you should play that message. Yeah, please. Yeah, next slide. Thank you.
colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Rishikesh Kumar Singh and to the all organizing committee of the Lucknow Summit 2025 for the kind invitation to participate as a plenary speaker in this important international conference on the geopolitics of climate change. I'm truly honored by your invitation and by the generous consideration of my academic work. Unfortunately, due to prior academic commitments and family issues, I'm not able to be present in Lucknow in person. I sincerely regret this, especially given the intellectual and political relevance of the conference and the distinguished international audience gathered. I hope very much that this will not be the last occasion for our academic exchange and that I be able to participate in person in the future. I'm nevertheless very pleased that my co-author Beatrice Pedretti is present at the conference and will present our joint research. Dr. Pedretti played a fundamental role in this study. She led the empirical research, coordinated data collection and analysis, and contributed in a decisive manner to the conceptual and methodological framework of the project. I'm deeply grateful for her work, and I'm confident that the audience will benefit greatly from her presentation. Our research focuses on the psychological impact of climate-related disasters, using the regional floods in Emilia-Romagna, Italy, as a case study. We examined the relationship between post-traumatic stress, general psychological distress, and climate-related worry following flood explosion. One of our key findings is that while climate worry is significantly elevated among exposed population, particularly individuals with PTSD, the severity of trauma symptoms is more strongly associated with proximal stress and temporal proximity to the disaster than with climate worry alone. We believe that this finding have particular relevance for countries such as India and the other regions of the Global South, where climate-related disasters are often more frequent, more intense, and more closely intertwined with social, economic, and infrastructural vulnerabilities. At the same time, they highlight important commonalities across contexts. Climate-related events act not only as environmental shocks, but also as long-term stressors that affect mental health, social trust, and collective resilience. From this perspective, mental health should be understood as a central component of climate adaptation and climatic justice, both in high-income countries and in the Global South. Addressing the psychological consequences of climate change is essential for strengthening individual agency, community resilience, and democratic decision-making in the face of environmental uncertainty. Let me also take this opportunity to express my strong interest in developing future academic collaborations with colleagues and institutions in India. Both the University of Milan and Pegasus University, which I represent, are deeply committed to interdisciplinary research on climate change, ethics, public health, and social resilience. I sincerely hope that this conference will serve as a starting point for joint research projects, comparative studies, and academic exchanges between Italian and Indian institutions. Let me conclude by once again thanking the organizers for their kind invitation and for their impressive efforts in bringing together scholars and policymakers from across the world. I wish all participants a very stimulating and successful conference and a fruitful continuation of the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention, and please accept my warmest regards.
Okay, Beatrice Pederetti is a research scholar from University of Milan, Italy, working at the intersection of neuroscience, neuropsychology, and climate change. Her work examines the psychological and cognitive consequences of extreme climate events, combining quantitative neuropsychological methods with psychosocial frameworks to inform evidence-based, people-centered responses. She has international experience on just transition and ESG communication, which includes coordination of global projects and organization of panels with philanthropic and policy partners.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you all for your, welcome and invitation. It is a truly great honor to be here at the Lucknow Summit 2025. We have seen that the summit gathers a diverse community of scholars to reflect on geopolitics of climate change and the escalating feedback loops that define our era. So we are not only witnesses of these loops, we are participants in them, and our responses will determine whether they spiral into catastrophe or resilience. As Rishikesh said before, I have the honor of presenting Professor Andrea Lavazza today, he is keen to thank you all for the invitation. So let's start. We can go to the next slide, thank you. Let me start with simple but urgent question. What happens to society when extreme climate events devastate lands and communities? The answer is not only economic or political, it is profoundly psychological as well. So before I begin with the presentation of the research, I would like to situate my work and Professor Lavazza's work within the intellectual landscape of this conference. So we have already entered the psychological, the cognitive dimension, also the narration, and the myths around floats with the amazing presentation of Professor Serenella Iovino. She has concluded with a powerful message and image so that ecological wounds are also wounds of the soul. And I completely agree. We are part of the world. We are connected with nature. So environmental humanities, anthropology, philosophy have taught us that climate change is not only just a biophysical phenomenon, because nature is much more. It intersects with culture, ethics, and narration. It reshapes how we imagine the world, how we tell stories about nature, responsibility, and the future. So, as a neuroscientist, my contribution approaches the same question, but from a different angle. So, what happens when those narratives are no longer only imagined or represented, but lived directly through our mind, our body? So extreme climate events are moments in which the environment becomes traumatic experience, and rivers enter houses, landscapes collapse. The abstract idea of climate change turns into memory, fear, and trauma. So in that moment, the human mind itself becomes a site where environment change is registered in our mind, processed, and then remembered. And in this sense, so our research treats the brain and the psyche itself as part of the ecological system, because we are part with our body, our mind, our souls of the ecological systems. So trauma, eco-anxiety, and resilience are not merely clinical outcomes. They are forms of environmental inscription, ways in which climate change writes itself inside our memories, inside our mind. And I think that studying mental health after climate crisis and disaster helps us understand how ecological crises transform also subjectivity, agency, and our capacity to imagine the future. So we are here to discuss climate threat from multiple perspectives. So the focus is not only on ecosystems, but on the human condition in the Anthropocene, on how societies, different cultures, individuals respond to crises that are ecological, political, and psychological all at once. So our contribution today highlights the human mind as a site of vulnerability. While geopolitics often emphasizes power, resources, and territorial disputes, which are important, but our research shows that climate change also reshapes psychological landscapes. So we can go from landscape to mindscapes, altering also cognition, emotional regulation, and resilience in general. So it is a pilot study focusing on victims of repeated flooding in a specific region in Italy. And I'm sure that all of you have in mind different situations similar to this one happened in India as well. So the floods in Emilia-Romagna, I would say, are not just an Italian story. They are a sort of a mirror of what communities across the globe are facing. So they reveal how climate trauma erodes security, weakens trust, and reshapes the very capacity of society to react, to adapt. Acute trauma from displacements and property loss in particular collided with chronic climate worrying, producing very measurable impact from a clinical and neuroscientific perspectives on mental health and also on cognitive functioning. So to play this in a broader frame, we have discussed all together during these days, climate change is now recognized not only as an environmental threat, but as an emergency, a public health crisis. So floods, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts are among the most disruptive stressors. And different meta-analyses in different countries and continents are demonstrating the very high level of post-traumatic stress disorder that we can register and observe in victims of floodings. But also we have to consider the way this trauma reshape our mind, leaving us with a sort of climate concerns and eco-anxiety that reshape the way we see the future, we see the world. Because eco-anxiety is diffuse and it's pervasive, so it is not tied to a single disaster, but to the perception of an unstable and very threatening environment. So it magnifies distress and undermines coping and erodes our trust. Understanding this interplay between acute trauma and chronic worry is essential, in my opinion, for designing also mental health strategies that address both the immediate suffering during this disaster, but also the long-term impact of them that sometimes we just don't think about. So a little bit of neuroscience. So the impacts of extreme climate events, as I said, are psychological, but not only psychological. So they are neurobiological, so reverberating through the body stress systems. We have said before, we are mind, we are soul, we are body, and this is all connected. So what happens in our brain then reflects in our psychological vision and in our body, in how we feel, in our symptoms. So in PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, which we directly observed in the study, we have this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that becomes dysregulated. So our cortisol signaling fails, leaving the body in a state of chronic activation, negative activation and stress. Also, the neurotransmitter system, so these molecules in our brain sending messages are disturbed. So for example, noradrenaline rises, so fueling this hyperarousal condition. Also serotonin and GABA decline, and they are essential for our mood regulation. So trauma leaves us with a sort of inability to regulate our emotions, and also glutamate surges, driving intrusive memories of the event, and giving us a sort of emotional instability. And this is the neurobiological aspect, so the molecules in our brain, but actually we can observe also modification at the structural level. For example, the amygdala, thinking about animals, the reptilian brain, so the brain's alarm center, becomes hyperactive, amplifying this fear response. And the medial prefrontal cortex, which is important for us to regulate emotions, to regulate the activation of amygdala, but also to think, process information, do problem solving, is underactive. And the hippocampus, which is crucial for memory making, and crucial also for contextualizing experience, showed an impaired functioning and sometimes a reduced volumes. So, as I said, the consequent extend beyond the body, extend beyond emotion. We have also cognitive impairments, so deficits. After a very strong trauma and a diagnosis of PTSD, we can register deficit in attention, in working memory, in planning and executive processing. So let's think about how can be changed in our brain. And so we think with our brain. So climate disasters intensify these difficulties. The regulatory systems is unable to restore balance. So we can say, if we want to think of an image, it's like trauma reverberates through cognition, then emotion, and the body alike, and then, of course, societies. So this research is grounded in the urgent need to understand how climate change affects the human psyche. So as extreme events and weather events become more frequent and intense, they are no longer isolated emergencies, but recurring stressor in the society that shape how individuals and communities perceive safety and stability and the future in general. And floods in particular are deeply personal and emotionally charged experience, because often they involve displacement, loss of property, loss of our home, and in our home, in our properties, in our family, there are parts of our identity, memories, and histories. So these events trigger this primal fear and leave lasting psychological imprints. So a very short presentation of the research, the pilot study, and the results before reasoning together on this. So the research was guided by 4 principal objectives. First of all, we want to assess the prevalence of PTSD, diagnose PTSD, understand from a clinical point of view the impact among flood-exposed individuals in this particular region in Italy. But then we also try to measure with psychological scales the level of depression, anxiety, stress, and we evaluated the climate change related worries to then intersect this finding, understand how the trauma can reverberate into the climate worry and depression itself. And at the end, thanks to multiple linear regression analysis, we also try to find predictors of the PTSD severity. So our pilot study employed a comparative cross-sectional design. Being a pilot study, the general population was not so big, so we only have 74 participants that were recruited. All of the subjects were adults, aged 18 years old or older, residing either in Emilia-Romagna, so the region affected by the flood. They were 13 total. And then we also had a focus, a control group in Lombardy, which served as a geographically proximate regional control area. So individuals in the exposed group reported having experienced direct and indirect consequences of the floods, included damage to property, evacuation or displacement, caregiving responsibility as well, witnessing severe damage within the communities. So by contrast, participants in the control group reported no exposure to remote comparable flooding, and this was of course essential to be part of the control group. Also, it was interesting because a small minority of participants in the control group reported having experienced a major flooding, but in a remote time, in 1987. And that was interesting because it allows us to explore the historical exposure and to see how trauma lives in our mind over time and over decades. So, to capture the multidimensional nature of psychological responses to flooding, we employed a set of validated, self-reported items, so psychometric scales, in this case, all administered in the native language of the participants, so in Italian. Just an overview for you to understand then the results after that. We use the International Trauma Questionnaire, which is used to if you want to diagnose the PTSD or the complex PTSD, then can be diagnosed after repeated exposure to climate events. And in Emilia-Romagna, flooding happened in 2023, more than one, and then in 2024 in the same areas. So the victims actually reporting having experienced this flooding 3-4 times. So then we use the depression, anxiety, stress scale to measure the different level of depression, anxiety, stress, and then we try to relate these levels with the levels of PTSD. And then we want to understand, as I said before, how this trauma changed the way we see and perceive the world, using the climate change worry scale to measure this worry about the climatic crisis. So let's see together the results. They were quite striking, as Professor Lavazza anticipated before, because the 33.3% of flood-exposed participants met the ICD, the criteria to get diagnosed with PTSD. So, whereas no cases were identified in the control groups. So we can see the difference. Very alike regional territories. One exposed by the flood, the other not. And we have 33.3% of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this categorical difference was mirrored by dimensional measure, because in the scale, we can measure different levels. So the re-experiencing, the avoidance, the sense of current threat that the victim experienced, and PTSD impairment. So we also can observe functional impairment in daily life, in our relations, in our social functioning. So we can say that these data allow us to go from a personal distress to a sort of, we can say, collective patterns, because these numbers do not reduce experience, but they translate it. So they allow us to see how individual suffering becomes a collective and a measurable, empirically measurable consequence of environmental disruption. So these are a lot of numbers, so I'll go very quickly. We can see the data. So especially the mean, the standard deviation demonstrates a neither level of PTSD symptoms in the experimental groups and also a higher variability between subjects. But then, as I said before, subject reporting remote exposure. So we have the victims of Emilia-Romagna, so recent exposure to flooding. We have remote people, with a remote exposure in 1987, so decades ago, and then the non-exposed. And as we can see in this graph, there is this gradient. So these people with a remote exposure still show higher, slightly higher, more variable trauma-related score than those who did not experience floods at all. So this means that extreme flooding events may leave psychological traces detectable decades later. Of course, we have a lot of individual variability, but yeah, so when participants were grouped according to this temporal distance, this gradient that we can see in the graph highlights the importance of temporal aspect in disaster exposure. So with recent events producing the most severe outcomes, for our mind for sure, but also they persist over years. So turning to general psychological distress, the depression, anxiety, and stress scales reveal marked differences between the groups. So in the control group, we can see with this dark green in the first graph, mean scores suggestly very lower than the exposed group. So the other one, the lighter green. So participants exposed to recent floods reported higher scores across all the domain, depression, stress, anxiety, approximately twice than of controls if we look at stress, for example. And the differences actually can be seen also in the second graph, when we can see people diagnosed with PTSD and people with no diagnosis of PTSD. So individuals in the PTSD subgroups consistently reported substantially higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, showing that trauma that related symptomatology was embedded with a broader pattern of psychological strain in general. And now we come to an interesting graph, in my opinion. Yesterday we have talked about gender justice and climate justice, about inequalities in climate change. And well, our data actually showed an unequal vulnerability in these shared disasters. Exploratory analysis revealed that distress patterns were not evenly distributed in our subject. So we can see in the first graph, women tended to report higher levels of stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD diagnosis than men. Also, in the second graph, we have age-related trends that were also apparent with middle-aged participants, so between 35, 50, reporting a major disruptive impact in their cognition. So also educational, occupational status appear to play a role as well, with individuals, for example, holding a university degree and those in active employment reporting higher distress and than rate rates of students, probably because of the major responsibilities they have in managing the traumatic experience, the level of awareness they have related to climate change and climate disaster. And in conclusion, this is the third psychometric scales. So climate worry was clearly elevated among flood-exposed participants and reached its highest level among those meeting criteria for PTSD or complex PTSD. So these suggest that direct exposure to flooding amplify not only trauma-related symptoms, but also the anticipatory concern about future climate threats. So that it is what I was trying to say before, that this data, the traumatic climatic event shapes the way we see the environmental crisis. So it shows how environmental crisis reshape our imagination and expectations, so not only our memory. Then we also we ran a predictive analysis to clarify the relative influence of different factors on trauma severity. And the results that we can see in the next slide. So when trauma severity, perceived stress, temporal proximity to the flood, and climate-related worry were analyzed all together, a clear hierarchy of associations emerged. So recent exposure, female gender, and elevated stress level before the event proved to be strong predictors of developing a PTSD diagnosis. So what do this number means? They tell us that floods and in general extreme climate events act as a sort of stress test for psychological resilience. So they reveal vulnerabilities even in regions with robust health infrastructures, as Emilia-Romagna. They show that trauma undermines daily functioning, trust, and collective resilience. And they remind us that psychological vulnerability persists across time and sometimes decades after the event. So these findings compel us to rethink climate adaptation, not only in material terms, but also in psychological ones. So trauma-informed care must be integrated into climate adaptation strategies. Public health messaging must acknowledge the psychological dimension of the climate change, and also resilience strategies should mitigate not only the short-term impact, but also the long-term impact of flooding on other climate-related hazards. So addressing psychological impacts is not a secondary concern, but it is a central dimension of climate adaptation and disaster preparedness. So let me now draw these threads together and connect our findings to the wider themes of this summit. So what emerges most clearly is that geopolitical vulnerability is, it is about territory, it is about resources, it is about infrastructure, but it is also profoundly psychological. So climate trauma is not confined to one nation, one region. So while this case study is Italian, the patterns that resonates across the globe. So hurricanes in Americas and cyclones in South Asia, wildfires in Australia, drought in Africa. So everywhere the human mind is being tested by the relentless pressure of climate change and extreme events. So this universality underscores the urgent need for international cooperation that does not treat mental health as an afterthought, but integrates it fully in the climate policy and adaptation strategies. So there is a cultural dimension too. So climate change narratives, so our literature, our arts, our collective imagination should include the psyche. They do, and they must acknowledge that climate change is not only a story of melting ice and rising seas, but also of anxiety, grief, and resilience. So trauma and eco-anxiety are not just peripheral phenomena. They are, in my opinion, central to how communities perceive, narrate, and resist the ecological doom loops that threatens our shared future. So I want to leave you with very short key three messages. So first, geopolitical vulnerability is psychological, as we said, as well as material, of course. Second, climate trauma is transnational, demanding solidarity and cooperation across border. So third, healing mind is inseparable from healing ecosystems. So we have said it many times, we are part of the nature, we are connected, so we cannot think only about the planet and not about the people. And same, not only about the people and forgetting the planet for sure. So if we fail to address the psychological dimension, our effort to replenish, resurrect, and resuscitate the earth will remain incomplete, because we cannot build resilience in the soil, the river, the forest, if we neglect resilience also in human soul and human mind. We cannot hope to restore ecosystems if communities remains paralyzed by trauma and fear. So to confront the Anthropocene, we must recognize that the climate crisis is also a mental health crisis. We are part of this world. And to conclude, I would like to share some testimonies from flood victims. These are their words and stories, their narration of their experiences, I would say. And while some demonstrate the erosion of memory and sense of security, some other offer a glimmer of hope and humanity. So the first one, there was water everywhere. We couldn't see an end to it. My house was flooded. I lost all my old family photos, including those of my grandparents. I feel like I've lost a piece of my memory, my identity, my history. I remember one sensation, my feet frozen in the water. I can't shake this feeling. Since it happened, I always sleep with waterproof boots next to my bed. I can't help it. It is as if fear is always just around the corner. And these first two testimonies, I think, are a demonstration of how the trauma reshaped the narration and the way of living of these people. While the last one is, I mean, it gives a glimmer of hope. And so it was difficult and it was terrible, but I don't think I've ever seen so much solidarity and resilience. After the floods, everyone helped to shovel the mud, welcomed us in their homes, donated clothes to those who had lost everything. In the midst of the disasters, we remembered what it means to be together, to be close to each other, to help each other, and to be human. Thank you very much for your attention. And once again, I would like to express my gratitude also on behalf of Prof. Lavazza. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice, for that very pertinent and detailed talk backed by the data from Italy. Indeed, an interdisciplinary research on climate change is the answer to solutions with dealing with it. Now, I introduce you to the next speaker. Dr. Rishikesh is a poet, an eco-critic, a researcher, a traveler, an environmentalist, and ecological facilitator. Professionally, he is a consultant clinical psychologist. He is the founder president of EFSLE. During his doctoral research in eco-criticism on neuro-eco-aesthetics from Gothenburg, Sweden, he explored the various unheeded facets of this particular field of study. His latest research project on the Bhutanese and Sikkimese women and their eco-critical concerns is in progress. He has initiated with this concept of bibliotherapy in India in 2012 that he practiced on those people who faced natural calamities and were distressed with ecophobia. So as a bibliotherapist, Rishikesh has incorporated nature with books. This therapy, what he calls eco-bibliotherapy, a step ahead to the traditional bibliotherapy. He presented his poems in the SARC Literary Festival 2010 and in various literary festivals in different countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. He has traveled extensively in the Western Europe, especially the Scandinavians, for the major research project on eco-criticism 2012-2015. He has translated the Earth Anthem into Bhojpuri language. He has edited 3 books on criticism so far. Story Hasrat in 2012, he did In 2012, he did a major research project in Malaysia, which was dedicated to the gender and human rights issues of the Tibetan and Bhutanese women. He has been an integral part of IPTA, Indian People's Theatre Association, and he is the director of Ecosophical Theatre Society. He facilitates the academia with his innovative teaching skills, especially in the field of applied literature, amalgamating literature, human rights, gender issues, and psychology together. Recently, he initiated in the field of neuroecoaesthetics, eco-surrogacy, bibliotherapy, green and blue humanities, geocriticism, and eco-criticism through the movement, what he calls Lake Movement, Literature, Environment, Gender, and Human Rights. To make the academician conscious about the ecological issues and the lake movement, Rishikesh has conducted a series of talks known as Travel and Talk in January 2024, giving extension to this ecosophical journey. This talk series received its new name, and now it's been called Travel, Talk, and Trees, which is 3 Ts.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm not going to, any kind of, lecture or, because, it's just a kind of, I'm going to add something to your presentation. And I'm really happy to see that, because, this session was needed. This session was needed because we don't think about the, cognitive, reactions towards the climate change. So the question is important, that how do our brain responds to these natural calamities? So I would like to say that, as you mentioned, that ecophobia, most of the people working in eco-criticism, they are aware of ecophobia, which is very prominent. And the way you did conduct your research in Italy, the way we did in South India during, after tsunami. So tsunami victims, they are also the same. They were facing almost the similar. So I was looking like, the similarity I saw with your research. So because I am not going to explain that kind of research, but I really appreciate that such kind of, discussion is also needed. Like after theory, what are the things in action? So this is what we are doing in the field. So when we conduct any such kind of research work in the field, so that actually, we are not just gathering the data, we are actually, analyzing the human mind through that, and also looking for the, consequences of these climatic, or disasters or calamities. So being, from the psychology field, I would really love to, the researchers to come out and explore something more into this field. And that is why this particular, platform, we are open with so many good research projects based on this, ecophobia or that eco-narratives related to the cognitive, reactions or responses. So this floor is open for the question at this moment, and I really welcome if you have something, to ask. Yeah, thank you, please.
Thank you very much, dear, for a wonderful presentation and for introducing really a new kind of concept, which definitely is the need of the time, as Rishikesh pointed it out. But I have a little bit of queasiness in the pit of my stomach, and that is why I'm just trying to know it and just trying to learn it. The size of data which you have taken for your research paper, and that size is also a place specific, place centric data. Now, of course, these kinds of climate threats do leave with a permanent kind of impact on our mind. Sometimes these impacts are ineffaceable. But as Rishikesh cited one example of tsunami in South India, Let me share with you that in Bihar, in Uttar Pradesh, in Assam, every year, a particular group of people, a particular group of tribe, they used to face this kind of floods, deluges. Now, the question is, ki when you are trying to establish your findings as a kind of new knowledge in the academia, we should also try to expand the size of data and try to study the kind of impact which these people are facing, because they are facing flood situations every year and they are not so much disturbed. I'm saying this because they now have developed a habit of enjoying the floods every year. They do not enjoy it, but they are not afraid of that kind of flood because they are accustomed. They have become accustomed. So whenever we try to establish a new kind of theory, a new kind of idea, a perspective, of course, we should, I think, broader the shape and size of data. What is your take on this particular thing? And second, in the last, the conclusion in which you cited few uh, perhaps direct statements of people who have suffered uh, the trauma of flood. The last one was quite pertinent. The human mind is not always negative towards the challenges. Rather, they become more mature also at times, of course. So their response and their resilience should also be given, provided with better space in your research, I think. This was one thing. And second, uh, these kinds of impacts, if those groups are left onto themselves, but if government tries to support them, if community comes ahead to support them, and if other group of peoples, NGOs, etc., they come, they quickly go back to their normal conditions also. So that too has to be, I think, included. That is my
Thank you. Thank you so much for your point of view. Thank you. I would like to start with your first intervention, and I totally agree. Unfortunately, it's very difficult when we do pilot study to just, we of course have a very limited population. That's why it's important to do pilot study and then make the research greater, longitudinal, and also to integrate with different studies from different cultures, different regions, to see the similarity, as you pointed out before, and also different ways to react. So I completely agree. We have population that has developed very strong resilience to this kind of trauma. I think this could be also from a therapy perspective, a possibility of learning to understand how we can manage this stress. And of course, our brain is also made to be sometimes positive and optimistic. So yeah, I agree. Sometimes in these terror and disasters, we can adapt, we can see resilience. So absolutely.
I just want to add here. Here I can say that size of data at this moment doesn't matter because we are like at the stage of identification, because this is the beginning. So as we identify the things first, then we can find out, try to find out some solution. S- that's true. Yes. Huh. Yeah, definitely. See, size of data, definitely it increases by the time. Like, over the time, it increases. Like, sometimes when we start any research, so then the other group involves. Yes, exactly, exactly. So every time, like, as we involve the other, different groups. Exactly. True. Yes.
This was the first one in Germania. So we started with, but I agree it's different to generalize results when it is a pilot study. Yeah, I mean, it's just a starting point to go deeper.
Exactly.
But
I would like to add a term here that we are trying to promote, that is circular theorization. Circular theorization, just because of this solving out your question. Because when we start any kind of data collection, so sometimes it is like restricted to a particular certain area. But again, we don't try to prove it, the same result, trying to, like exactly. So then what field as well. Completely different terrain, different area. And because she's from a place where like less population, yes, and you're like you are just imagining the the huge Indian population. So you're definitely there's also kind of psychological response that they become accustomed to it. Yeah. Yes. So it's quite not really. Like the street where I live is flooded every rainy season, right? And each time it is struggling. Nobody becomes resilient, yes, floods and all these kind of, you lose pieces of your memory, your favorite things when you went somewhere and you got some souvenir, and then you're asleep at night. And I remember a couple of years ago, one of my friends, she was sleeping on the bed, and suddenly she gets up. She thinks that her daughter has peed on the bed, right? And she gets up and gives a big slap to her daughter. But what happened is that the books were gone and everything. It just happens. You don't know. Nobody tells you that tomorrow there's going to be flood. All of a sudden it rains all night, and then the things are choked, or whatever happens, something or the other, the news relatives, whatever happens, and then it's terrible. Yeah, nobody gets over this trauma, and it haunts you for a long, long time. I remember until now I'm haunted by what happened in 1999 super cyclone. I just returned from the US, and the next day it was tough. Sister, or the next yeah, but there are many more people who face this and they do not have many things to lose, even in those blood applications. So, what I mean to suggest is if we are recording the psychological needs, our responses to those things, that kind of response should be accommodated into such a kind of wonderful research. In psychology, we gather so many senior kind of responses. Yeah, exactly. Like just one example. Why did I mention tsunami? Why did I mention the floods as well? Because I also not the same data. I know because as we were trying to say, we are habitual, but we know, like our perception is like that. Yes, that it will be going to happen. Exactly. But tsunami has something, it was a different kind of design. Yes. So why do we come to the major incidents? The tsunami was one of them. But, like one a person who started and like created a fear towards waters that much that he was not able to drink water. For many days he couldn't drink water. And finally it was really tough for his survival. Because whenever he saw the water, even in glass also. So such kind of like severity we face. So this is a big challenge in psychology, and in psychology collecting data is also another big challenge. So we are doing, let's say this is the basic. That's don't take to go there. Yeah, it doesn't really. Yeah. So thank you, Beatrice. I want to thank Beatrice and Shigesh for this very, very harmonious dialogue that you had with Beatrice and the research is very important. And please convey my gratitude to Manas. The presentation was very good. So I was thinking, while you were asking the question I had in mind was that now it's time for a comparative study, and I was thinking about, I wanted to ask you whether you are planning doing a comparative study. And also, my curiosity is, do you have what
what use the template. You say that this is the first pilot study for Italy. I would like to know a little bit more, but really, of course, about the literary, the precedent, the literature, the psychological literature about this kind of testing. And only briefly, also adding my voice to these testimonies about climate disasters and the reaction. So what you say is really important, but also what Rishikesh and Patricia said is important. In fact, this, I think the difficulty of performing such studies is also that the community, the people tested, and it's must be at the same time very site specific, and you have also to think in global terms, because of course the results of this test be applied on a larger level. But it is possible and unavoidable to use site-specific data. And in fact, if you take site-specific data about, for example, earthquakes in Italy or volcano eruption, earthquakes in Italy, for example, and you compare them, please correct me, with the psychological or even the political responses that are given in Japan, you find two different words. So in Italy, despite the fact that Italy lies on an earthquake line, the African plague and the Euro-Asian plague, so they collide, and Italy is an earthquake-ridden land. So there are earthquakes almost every year, and some of them are really catastrophic earthquakes. So, but believe me, it's always as if it will be the first time. We have not developed a convincing political response to earthquakes, whereas, as you see, with the earthquake, we haven't learned to live with the earthquake, and then psychological reasons are still to be known. And I come from a volcanic region. The volcano in Naples is active. The last eruption has taken place in 1943, so it's still a live volcano, but the population lives all around the volcano. Why? Whereas in Sicily, the volcano is active, and every year you see the activity, and so the people, of course, are more used to this interaction. You see, the responsibility. I think we add to that question. Can I just?
Thank you so much for the nice presentation. The Dr. Basic is explaining the data, which is more qualitative. But the presentation is done by her, is more quantitative. So in the quantitative research, data has many meanings that we have to do. First of all, we have to take the sample size that should be representative. So you are taking 30, 44, I don't know how you did that, taken in terms of the sufficient sample size or not. So this is one thing. And another thing, you are going to build the model building. That is estimation. If you do the estimation, it should be many things that you have to perform. One thing that you have to normality of the data, collinearity of the data, heterogeneity of the data. So these are the many mathematical requirements that you have to fulfill if you go for the prediction, if you go for the estimation and model building. And you told that one is a multi-linear regression, something like that. If you analyze the variables, that is factors, independent factors, and your is anxiety, depression, and then stress, these are the dependent, I think. So you should come up with the factor that is more effective in terms of the regression coefficient. That will be the very essential So in the quantitative research, data has many. Thank you so much. Thank you. Very great question. That is a comparative study between two very diverse regions. For example, Italy, from our Lucknow Summit, South Indian community, Southeast Indian community from India. I mean, they are two very different kinds of population. It will like competing in competing in disasters, competing in misfortune. So is a comparative study at all possible between two kinds of disasters? That's my related question. I'll try to. One thing just to question, in the sense the politics, world is politics. Your whole scenario is the psycho system. Is it merged to the politics of this system? Where is politics and this type of politics and any adjustment, understanding and adjustment? It's referring to the praxis. Basically, we have 5 minutes, and if we would complete, yeah, that is the point of politics. Yes, the praxis of the psycho system. Yes. But the idea I'm talking about the ideas and the nowadays, simplicity, everything is pressure from the political and everything. But the issue is like mental and depression. There are so many things. Doctor says, I don't know what is going on. So, I- this one, it is also a major issue. Okay, we'll quickly wrap this up and we have 5 more minutes to hang it now. So, politics, that is the root of politics. Politics.
Thank you. The study is made to inform, of course, we are neuroscientists, so we can act in a very political way. So the idea is for the data to inform policymakers. And as for the empirical analysis, of course, we checked for multilinearity and coefficient and regression. I didn't report it to I didn't want the presentation to be boring, but of course, in the study, we have multiple linearity checking and coefficients all reported at the end of the research. I agree to connect Serenella's question that for sure it is a pilot study. So the idea is just to start discussing the problem because yet in Italy we do not have many research on this field, but for sure it's needed to make it bigger, make it longitudinal, and if possible, make a comparison. But as you said, it is difficult because there are a lot of different elements to be considered, different way of being resilience, different cultures, different policy, politics, landscape, different geographies. For sure, these are all different elements and variables that we should consider. So this is why I think interdisciplinary speaking is necessary to inform also resilience plans. So we have the psychological, the health opinion. We need the political opinion. We need the geographical opinion because they linked together are essential to then inform policymaker in a way to be effective for our society. I don't know if I replied to all your question, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Dr. Rishikesh. Thank you all for attending this session. Parents announcement that lunch is ready and we have decided to postpone this next session and we will accommodate it after the lunch because just after the lunch we have another keynote address by Professor Anand Tripathi and his lecture will be online and he is too old to wait. All right, so I request all of you to please take your lunch and please join us in time. Do not waste time, please. Because after taking lunch, we just because after gathering, we have this kind of reflection, talk, discuss things. But please be in time here. Yes. Please, this is your part. Yes. Please come. Peter, join us. Sir, sir, Yes, please come.